Okay, I think Sharon, I can see you have your hand up.
Thank you. I have a couple of things. One is I totally agree with, and I'm glad the Perth and Kinross Council is looking at allocating land for allotments and community gardens. To my knowledge, there aren't any in Crieff, but we do have Comrie Croft, which is down the road. If you can take the bus and go there and pick up a weekly food veg box. But they also can bring it to the food bank in Crieff and in Comrie. And that's really nice, but that's absolutely seasonal. And during the winter months, they're produce from all over the place, but it's all organic. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I don't really need kiwi fruit in the middle of winter. I know it's great for, the vitamins and all that, but so that's a scheme that they have going on. Our local community garden, which was just started by a volunteer, one of the things that they're doing is they, on behalf of the food bank, have produce available to anybody in the community on a daily basis. And what the scheme they've just picked up, which is not local at all, but it's any of the fresh produce left over at the end of the day from the local co-op is being taken to this food bank by volunteers at the end of the day. So I'm really pleased that that's happening in our community, and that should be something that's happening everywhere. The question is, how do you get it there? How do you access it? Where do you store it? And so it's the Crieff Community Garden, if you want to know how they're doing it. I do think we need a really big campaign on seasonability and our seasonal foods and what to do with them, because really, I agree, we don't need strawberries in the middle of winter, and we know that our strawberries don't come on until spring, and we shouldn't be eating them. We never did in the past. So anyway, thank you.
What was the word I'm looking for here? Sorry. Seasonal, is that a word? Yeah. Okay. Okay, does anyone have anything? So I've tried to group it into sort of themes. So this, the last group spoke a little bit about supermarkets and how trying to keep it local. There's been a lot on finding, growing space. Logistics was a big one. There was things said about knowledge and education. Does anyone else have any more on these ones, the orange ones? So people were wanting, kind of more knowledge around. Someone said, if you were given a pear, maybe someone wouldn't know how to use a pear in their cooking, everyday cooking, and that kind of thing.
Can I just say, this is Sharon. I have my hand raised. I'll put it down. I don't know if I know that there's something going on in Parliament. I know Jim Fairley, our MSP, one of his big things is he wants every child to be able to make a bowl of soup and to know where these things come from. So that definitely should go into as reinforcing, and that can be all year round.
Mm-hmm. I agree with the idea of teaching and having workshops and training around traditional ways of preserving food. And so, if you have, if you eat seasonally, back in the day, you would have to preserve that food in a certain way. And even things like cheese, which evolved as a way of preserving milk and the way you can eat cheese and eat into the winter. So I think what we need to do is bring back these traditional skills and abilities, and we need to teach people again, because in the past they would have been passed down from generation to generation, but we've become so disconnected from food production that we now are completely reliant upon supermarkets for our food, and it puts us in a very vulnerable and dangerous situation. And so if you can give people back these skills, it means that then that would feed into the locally, the local food growing strategies, where you can growing them in small projects for local people in local areas, could then also work together to preserve into the winter time until the next springtime comes for growing. So it's not just about children. I think it is important to teach children basic cooking and food growing and preserving skills, but I think that extends actually to the whole community now, because we're so disconnected. Everything's so what's the word? Instant, It's okay to talk about strawberries in the winter,
Sorry to butt in, folks. I'm your facilitator, and I've been kicked out for about 5 minutes by IT problems, but I'm back with you now. So hopefully you've already started without me. But the idea is that you now add to some of the ideas that the first group had thrown up on here. So I think you already started doing that. You were talking about education there and what we need to do around education around food for adults and children. But if we take some of the headings that are on here, a lot of it was around better access to food, how we get food to people and people to food. So how we distribute, how we get the local food to the right areas, how we make it affordable, how we educate people around seasonality and around what food is available and how to use it as well, things like that. So if you can look at some of the headings and some of the ideas that are on here, and you probably have started this already, so apologies I'm coming in late, and kind of add to them. So a bit of the how and a bit of the what we need to do. Shannon,
yes, can I just edit the one that says make food cheaper? I agree with that, but local food should be the cheapest of all. And so when we go into, people might say, I'm going to go to this place because I can get my produce cheaper. And, people go to Aldi all the time because it's the cheapest. And they do carry a lot of Scottish produce, but it's Scottish and it doesn't necessarily tell you where. So I think the making local food cheaper and more expensive, the ones that are coming from out with, and, certainly Europe, it might help us all start to come to that realization that local's better.
Yep, absolutely. One of the themes that came up in the first group was about space to grow food. We talked about hidden orchards, we talked about allotments, spaces in maybe school grounds or close to schools where we could grow food. Anybody get any thoughts on that? I want to build on that at all? Yep, sorry, Kerry, I think you got your hand up.
Yeah, that has been a big issue for the discussions that have happened in our local community, is actually getting space to grow food communally. Because a lot of land in Scotland, especially the north of Scotland, is privately owned. You have huge expanses of land that are privately owned that no one's doing anything with really other than sheep farming. And then yet you have people who are desperate for land just to grow some vegetables locally as a community to feed their local community. And I guess that links in with the wider economic issues of Scotland in general, and our culture and our heritage, and the politics of space and how we use it and how we access it.
Okay, so what's our ask of Scottish Government? What do we ask them for in terms of this consultation?
Well, community-owned land would be good, so that we could actually have spaces locally. In the group I was in before, that was something that came up, but actually the whole idea of what is local food. And we make an assumption that food has to be produced on this larger scale, but actually, if you had something based in every community, like a plot of land for every community, where there was enough space, I mean, depending on the size of the community, you might only need an acre or two, so that the community themselves could work together to produce the food that they need to supply their local shop, for example. And that would make it cheaper as well. And I agree with Sharon, it should be the cheapest out there, and it often isn't. I know in our local shop it's the most expensive because they're having to buy it in sometimes from Tesco because they can't actually get a local supplier.
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous.
Okay, what else have we got?
Yeah, could the government give some incentive, not necessarily paying, but kudos to the large landowners and publicity and whatever, to say a very small part of their land has been made available for community growing, and advertise it locally and nationally if necessary. perhaps they just don't think about it. Some way of communicating and publicising it.
Absolutely, thank you. Okay, let's look. We also talked about protected cropping. I think by that, the first group were meaning how we can maybe use things like
that everyone has.
Oh, hello folks, I think we've just moved rooms. Okay, Rachel, you could share the board again for us. Hi folks, my name is Paul, I'm the facilitator for this group. I think we've just moved into our third group. So this is question 1, how can Scotland grow more of what it eats and eat more of what it grows? We have a very busy board, so apologies for that, but I'll give you a very quick run through of it. And then I'd like you to try and add to and build on the suggestions we've got on here. So there's some themes coming out of the first 2 groups around, first of all, how we can grow more of what we eat. And that was about making land available for growing, whether it be community spaces, whether it be allotments, whether it be spaces at school, whether it be persuading large landowners to give up part of the land to grow food on. There were suggestions around protected cropping and how we can extend seasonality through potentially polytunnels or vertical farming, things like that. And then there was a bit about eating more of what we grow, which was around educating people around how to use local produce, educating in schools, things like wonky veg and making that more accessible and better understood. And then the whole accessibility thing, local markets, localized distribution, how we can get smaller suppliers to supply local communities rather than mass production, that sort of thing. So that's a very quick overview, but would love to hear your thoughts on some of these subjects and what we want to push back to Scottish Government in terms of consultation. So over to you guys. Anybody? Any thoughts? What about in terms of education? We start with that. What do we need to do around educating people around local food? Does anybody want to contribute? Are you still reading the screen? Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. Give you a minute or two to have a read through and then just jump in when you feel ready.
I don't know if it covered it, but how to take food out of the ground, when to take it out of the ground. Sorry, how to take food out of the ground and what to do with it. You know, to get to that stage of cooking can be quite difficult sometimes if you don't know much about it. You know, if you're just starting to grow, when things are ripe, when things can be harvested, how you store things, all that kind of things. I think quite a big thing.
That's a really good point, yeah.
In terms of education.
Touches on seasonality, but also, as you say, storage, so that we, you know, make the most of the local resources rather than shipping things in from across the world. Absolutely.
I also think, you know, a lot of these farmers markets and farm shops are great, but quite often the produce is quite expensive there and it possibly puts people off. Somebody, I think I saw something, access to wonky veg, you know, that would be good. And also, we used to, when we were kids, we used to go and pick our own. And there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of that kind of thing going on anymore. So, you know, maybe more kind of local efforts to help harvest stuff would be good too.
Yeah, there's a mention in the first group about hidden orchards, and orchards have been let sort of fall into disrepair, and how we can maybe bring those back and things like that. Yeah, all good points. Thank you. Seems to be just the three of you in this group. We may have lost a few people along the way.
I think that access to wonky veg is an interesting one, because where we are in Perth and Kinross is, well, and Fife to some degree, we've got some big food processors. You know, we've got the likes of Kettle Produce just down the road. We've got Stuart's at Tayside along the road. You know, there's some big farm-based, or rather primary produce-based businesses that are growing and packing for the retailers. Now, the retailers have got quite strict specifications on their produce, and a lot of the what's known as outgrade veg ends up going as cattle feed, or ends up going for other purposes. And you know, just because it doesn't aesthetically look good, it doesn't end up on the consumer's plate or in retailers. So I do think there's definitely an opportunity there to utilize produce which doesn't necessarily meet the retailer specifications.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the groups touched on that earlier as well, in terms of getting a better understanding of what's out there that doesn't meet grade and how it could be better, not diverted, but better directed to the right places, rather than, as you see, going to animal feed or worse still, waste. Yep, absolutely.
The other one, just which I picked up on, which is really good, and I agree with, is the vertical farming, because land is a finite resource. You can't grow more land. And I guess the pinch is land prices are always going to keep rising. And trying to go to a farmer or a landowner saying, will you give up some land? Like, the answer is probably going to be no, unless there's a clear incentive for them.
Yeah.
But I think there is an opportunity in urban growing, or where you can get a small vertical farming unit, say in the school or in like a community centre or somewhere that is accessible to people. It links with the education piece, because they learn about how the food is grown. It's using new technologies, and it's also not using up a great deal of space and land as well. So it's like a win-win all round.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
So I would support that in certain situations, but you know, it kind of rings wee alarm bells with me in some situations, because it just seems to divorce people more from the real world. You know, in some situations, I quite agree that there are places where that's really useful. And certainly there's a premium on land, but maybe that's because we don't value growing land nearly high enough in Scotland. It seems to always be built on or whatever. Yeah, I kind of agree with you, but it does worry me a wee bit that we're moving away from the kind of traditional way of growing.
It's one of these conflicts of interest, isn't it? It's like, you know, we've got a growing population, so there's a growing need for housing. Housing needs to go somewhere, so it often goes on productive agricultural land. But then you've also got farmers out there that are now growing crops for fuel. So likes of rye, you know, rye gets fed into anaerobic digesters, which then gets fed into the grid. So there's like a constant conflict between food versus fuel versus housing. And I don't think that's going to go away, not anytime soon, unfortunately.
And also there's more and more emphasis on growing trees and you know, greening up the biodiversity, which is also another pressure. It's a good pressure, obviously, but as you say, there's less and less good growing food space around. But I suppose if every community can get a growing space, then that would be a start, which is not the case at the moment, certainly. So that would be a good aim, you know, where there's demand, obviously. But there should be some growing space in every community.
Okay, Let's have a look what else we've got. How do you think we could persuade people away from this idea of having everything available all year round, back to sort of seasonality? So, you know, you can buy strawberries in December and all this sort of stuff. How can we get people back to understanding that maybe that's not available if you want to buy it locally, and it's maybe not the best way to source your food?
I think education, Paul. I think that's
Mhm.
a key thing from our the local supplier that we use. We're saying local, they're based in Edinburgh for our fruit and veg, but they use a lot of local suppliers into the supply chain. So they work very closely with them. But what they do is they promote the seasonality of a lot of the produce through social media now, through their newsletter, and they're very big on, like, you know, if it's plums in September, let's push to you know, maximize what we've got.
Mhm.
And they're very good. So I think it's getting the message out there.
Yeah, absolutely. There were some suggestions in the sort of turquoise post-its around supermarkets and ways to influence supermarkets to have more local food, to be able to identify what's local more easily, potentially showing price differences or some sort of incentive to stock local food or more local food. Have you got any thoughts on that? Always difficult being the last group because all the best ideas are gone and all the stuff's on the board already. But
I find with the sorry, it's Jackie. I find with the big supermarkets, an awful lot of this seems to be playing to what they think the media headlines are, because as a food bank, I have to drive there at strange times if they give me enough notice to pick up produce, and yet they've got vans that are driving around the streets every single day. You're not telling me that they can't just drop that stuff off en route? So, and they also make claims of one thing as opposed to what's actually delivered. So I'm not sure that the supermarkets, the large ones in particular, are really doing anything more than looking after their media presence. So I think a lot more could be done with them for them to actually really deliver more with boots on the ground that are
yeah, I
already
suppose
here.
there has to be a what's in it for them, as always with these things. So I suppose it's making that incentive or disincentive to do the right thing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, don't advertise you're giving me food for 171 people unless you're actually doing it. That's false advertising. So if they want to use me, then they have to deliver.
Mhm. But I think we're in our last few seconds, so we're probably going to get pulled back to the main session soon. So thank you very much for your contribution. Any last ideas anybody wants to throw up before we finish? And apologies for the technical gremlins that got into the session. I think we got cut off for a few minutes earlier. I think we're about 30 seconds on my clock that I can see on the screen. Certainly there's a lot there, and with the other groups questions as well, there's a lot to feedback, which is great. So thank you for that.